Hey there. So, Happy New Year. Wow, it's been a whirlwind of a year already, and it is only January 15th. I got married this year. That was pretty cool. I'm super excited. Really, really excited and really, really happy. It is amazing how God brings things out of the wilderness and into a wild, whole new reality. It's absolutely amazing. So this morning, afternoon, is it afternoon? Whatever time of day it is when you're watching this, I want to talk to you. Oh, you like my shirt? It says, she believed she couldn't, so God did. I love it. I love this shirt. It's a really encouraging one. But back to the point. So the point of today's video is that I want to talk to you about dating questions to ask when you're ready to start dating again, and you want to know about sexual addiction, pornography addiction, and that kind of thing. It's a bit of a, how do you start that conversation? Bit awkward, bit unnerving. And I was actually in a coaching session just recently, and someone asked me, how long in your relationship with your husband, how long did you wait before you started asking questions about dating? I mean, not about dating, but before you were dating, how long did you wait before you started asking questions about porn and sex addiction and those kind of things? And I was like, first 2-3 weeks. She's like, wait, what? I said, no, really. If you're not, if you haven't covered that ground, don't even start dating somebody. In today's world, addiction is so prevalent and it is so widespread that if you haven't, it's not safe to even start dating someone if you haven't already asked key, pertinent questions about what their mental sex life, as well as their physical sex life, is all about. She's like, so how exactly did you go about bringing up that question? And I kind of chuckled because my husband will tell you that I kind of took a no holds barred approach. Basically, I didn't flirt. I just did roundhouse kicks, straight to the teeth. And I asked all the hard questions really early and right up front. Now, I'm not saying that that's some magic formula for everyone else, and I'm not saying if you do this, you'll find an amazing man just like I did. But I do think that it's actually really, really wise to ask super hard questions very early in any potential relationship, because if someone can't handle those hard questions, first, you need to know that right away. And second, you need to ask those questions before you're emotionally attached enough that it's going to hurt if this answer is one that you don't like. So you want to be able to ask those questions without any varnish, without any holding back, none of that. So then she asks me in that that coaching session, she's like, hey, so how did you bring it up? I was like, I just asked straight out. We were texting and I didn't even ask a yes or no question. I just said, so how much porn do you watch? And she's like, oh, whoa. I was like, yeah, well, if somebody's going to have to think about it to say no, I want to have to make them actually ponder that. And I just based it on the assumption that something like 80% of today's men are addicted to porn or watch porn regularly. So I'm going to throw it out there based on that assumption and see what he says. So then she says, well, how do you know if someone is addicted to pornography? I said, well, now I'm coming at this conversation based on the assumption that you, in my audience here, that you are a woman of faith who believes in God. And I'm not saying that you are a super religious, churchy kind of person, but that you believe in God, in faith, that you have a higher standard for morality, that you want sexual purity and sexual loyalty and faithfulness in a relationship. And I know that the majority of you in my audience, the whopping majority, have experienced sexual betrayal, infidelity, pornography addiction, sexual indiscretions by your spouse or former spouse. So coming from that perspective, and of course was my background too, coming from that perspective, it's super important starting a new relationship to lay the groundwork that those aspects are things that you aren't going to have any part of in any new relationship. So here's what I told the girl I was talking to. And I said, well, first of all, before you ask, hey, have you ever been addicted to pornography, ask some other questions first. Ask, what's your definition of pornography addiction or sex addiction? Find out what the guy thinks addiction actually looks like. And assuming that he replies with a reasonably operative definition, a working definition that's acceptable, then ask him next, how much pornography usage or indiscriminate sexuality or even sexual activity in an unmarried but committed relationship, ask how much he thinks is too much. What's acceptable usage of these things and what's not? Personally, if you ask me, any pornography usage of any kind at all, softcore, nothing, all of it, anything is too much. I am a firm believer that pornography is directly linked with the sexual trafficking industry, and that at its core, all porn is exploitation of the people involved and exploitation of those who are passively digesting the material. And I believe that it is addictive. Studies say more than sugar, more than cocaine, and that those who are regular consumers of pornography they automatically, you cannot help it, you suffer reduction in empathy, reduction in understanding and connecting with other people and intimacy, and it can stay with you long-lasting subconscious attitudes of misogyny and hatred against women and viewing women as objects rather than as whole people. So I am a firm believer in zero porn is acceptable. But hey, if you're talking to this guy that you like and you want to get to know him more, ask him how much he thinks is acceptable and how much is too much. Then ask, so do you think that you've ever considered yourself addicted by your own definition? And then see what he says from that. And then ask how long it's been since he used or looked at it last. Because a lot of times I've seen a lot of people who actually are addicts that will say, oh, I'm clean, I'm not using now. And the way that they deliver that statement is definitely intended to make you feel and assume like it's been years. I've been clean for years. I haven't been involved in any sexual acting out or addiction. But here's the thing. A lot of times I've seen people make those exact kind of statements, and what they really mean is they aren't using right now while they're holding their phone in their hands in front of you, because they used this morning, they used yesterday, they were watching porn last night, they were watching porn 6 days out of 7 last week. So you want to make sure that you actually ask, how long has it been since you used porn or looked at porn last? And then you want to ask another question too, somewhere in all of this, and that is, what is your definition of pornography? What do you think constitutes pornography? Because another thing that I've heard often is that those who are addicted to porn will say, oh, I don't watch porn, but they will watch X-rated pornographic movies. Because it's not labeled porn, they say it doesn't qualify as porn, even though it's sexually arousing, and visually they are acting in ways that are sexually unfaithful to either their spouse or their future spouse. So while my friend is sitting here kind of like choking on her own saliva at the boldness of all of this, at the same time, she's like, man, I need to do that. I got to do that. Because these are things you don't want to be finding out 10 years into a marriage. You don't want to be finding out 10 months into a relationship where you've fallen in love with someone. Because at that point, here's why. At that point, you're going to be actively looking for reasons not to believe the truth that they finally tell you. You're going to be looking at ways to minimize the fallout and to find, instead of saying, hey, this is untenable, this is a situation where I cannot move forward, instead of being able to make clear-cut decisions, if you wait a long time to ask these questions, you're going to be faced with the instinctive desire to try to see how much you can manage. How much can you live with? Instead of saying, this is incompatible with the life that I want to build for my future. I want a life that is free of sexual betrayal and that is free of infidelity and addiction in the areas of sexuality. And if you wait a long time and you're already wrapped up in attachment and affection, you are naturally, normally, very, very understandably going to be saying, well, maybe I can just live with that. Well, maybe that isn't quite so bad. Well, maybe if it never goes beyond that. And the thing is, that is not the nature of addiction. Addiction grows. And addiction causes deception. And once you are dealing with addiction, nothing will ever quite be the same again. It impacts everything. Trust, belief, intimacy, vulnerability, empathy, all those things are negatively impacted when sexual addiction is part of the picture. Now, so then that's not all the questions that you should ask. So once you've decided, once you've gone through, what's your definition of pornography addiction? How much is too much? How much is acceptable in the guy's mind? Once you've asked him if he would ever consider himself having been addicted by his own definition, what did his definition of pornography look like? Then you get down to the real stuff. That's just the warm-up questions, girl. What about masturbation? Do you believe that masturbation without porn is acceptable, even though you're basically taking what God created to be shared between two people and you're having sex with yourself for your own pleasure instead of saving that to be shared with the person that God created it for you in mutual intimacy? Find out what he believes about that. Because, hey, some people have had a plethora of sexual experiences, or they used to watch porn. All the files are in their brain, whether it's real life files in your brain or screen files in your brain. They can just access it in their head, and they don't actually need pornography in the moment for masturbation activity. And then you're dealing with someone who is still acting with sexual addiction. They're just not looking at it actively right now. They're just doing the other things related to viewing pornography. So then here's another question with that. What is this guy, whoever it is that you're liking and talking to, what is his definition of healthy intimacy in a marriage relationship? What does he think that looks like? And what does he think about vulnerability? About extreme, radical, total truthfulness? And then here's the zinger on that question. Ask him, have you ever had a relationship where you could be totally truthful and you had that kind of intimacy that you say you want? Ask him what his benchmark is. And here's your follow-up question. So if you have had that with someone, why aren't you married to her? Why are you single now? And if you haven't, how do you know you are capable of it? Or do you hold that up as a goal in your mind and then you end up sabotaging it because of your own issues? Ask him that. And if he says he did have it, ask him to have that kind of relationship. Ask him if he knows at this point anything that he may have done to contribute to the demise of that relationship. And has he addressed those negative mental soundtracks from his past that would make him revert back to assuming that any relationship with you is going to turn out just like the relationship did with her? So let's just say you ask a guy this and he gives you all the right answers. He's like, hey, I don't watch porn. And you're like, that's cute. I've heard that before. No offense. And then he's like, no, really, I don't watch porn. And you're like, okay, so when was the last time you watched porn? And he says, it hasn't been since I was a teenager, or it hasn't been in the last 10 years, or the last 5 years, or since I decided to really get serious about my relationship with Jesus and God washed me clean of that. So then here's your next question. All right, so you don't watch porn. You haven't watched porn in a long time. You say you are legitimately clean of sexual addiction. What do you do instead of porn? What else do you do? Prostitutes, strip clubs, hookers. I know that's a really demeaning phrase. Probably shouldn't use that. But okay, so yeah, prostitutes, strip clubs, magazines that you don't define as pornographic, sexy TV shows that are not labeled pornographic, random hookups. What do? And the follow-up question to that is, how do you, as a single Christian man, how do you meet your sexual needs without porn, since you're saying you don't watch porn? Now, that's a lead-in for the next deep conversation to have. And the next deep conversation is asking him what he believes about whether or not men have an innate, gender-driven need for sexual release. Because that's how I worded that question, right? How do you meet your sexual needs without porn? So I worded that way on purpose. Because the next question is, do you believe that sexual release is a human need or a male need? Now, that's a very common belief in many Christian theologies, philosophies, and teachings, is that sex is a need. Now, most likely, most of the time, nobody is saying that sex is a female need, that women need sex. The message is that women need to make themselves available to relieve men's need for sex. But see, here's the thing. If sex is a core human need, the activity of sex, if it's a core human need, like breathing, sleeping, eating, then we would die without it, and it would be absolutely humanly impossible for anyone to stay celibate outside of marriage, even in the way that God created us. So, since we can live without sex, and God created in the original creation sexuality to be mutually experienced as one friend of mine puts it, as a ministry of pleasure from one spouse to the other spouse in a committed lifelong marital relationship where there is intimacy and empathy and communication and connection and vulnerability and shared emotional oneness, as well as the physical oneness of sex. If that is how God created humanity, which he did, because he also says that it is a sin to have sex outside of marriage, then sex is not a male need. I know. The men who are watching this and have stayed with me this long are just minds exploding here. But sex is not a human need for either gender in order to function. Sex is a gift. It is a beautiful, sacred, amazing, wonderful gift that God created on purpose to be enjoyed and engaged in a healthy and regular basis within marriage. But being married still doesn't make sex a male need or a female one. It's a gift. It's a sacred activity of mutual connectedness between two people who are also emotionally and mentally and spiritually committed for life. So that misunderstanding, though, I remember one time my husband and I were talking back when we were engaged, and we were talking about this, and he starts laughing. He says, I think that's something that's made up by a bunch of horny men who want to guilt trip their wives and their girlfriends into making sure that they cross their boundaries and have more sex than they're willing to have outside of marriage. Because that also leads to the also erroneous belief that once men are aroused, they simply must finish the job. I know, I'm trying to still be kind of family, okay? You know, this is something you may or may not want to play with all your children listening, but you get my drift, right? So a lot of men and a lot of women. I remember a pastor's wife, young woman, telling me once when I was much younger that she'd never heard of anyone. She couldn't think of any young man who might kiss his girlfriend passionately and not go home and need to masturbate to finish. Because once a man gets aroused, he must finish himself off. And that is another completely erroneous falsehood. Arousal does not require completion. To say that, to imply that, is to say that men are the weakest of all people because they simply cannot be placed in charge of themselves. They can't control themselves. They can't stop once they've started. They can't manage their thought life. They are simply helpless and captive to any sexual innuendo or stimuli or anything that comes across, external, sensory, anything that comes across their path. They are simply captive to raging sexual hormones and desire. And you know what? I have a better view of men than that. I think men can be strong and self-regulated and self-controlled and in charge of their own thoughts, just like we expect women to be. I think men have got this whole, it's a self-defeating idea that you are completely captive to all sexual sensory stimuli, and yet you are also supposed to be the stronger sex. You're supposed to be the leaders. You're supposed to be the ones in charge. You're supposed to be the hero. You're supposed to be the warrior. But when it comes to sex, there's absolutely nothing you can do to control anything at all. And God forbid that you actually have to stand up for yourself. I wouldn't want to believe that I was limited that way. And I don't believe men are either. I believe men absolutely have the ability and the God-given direction to control, regulate, and discipline themselves and to stay firmly in charge of their thoughts and their actions, regardless of the stimuli around them. Now, there's a whole rest of conversations that we could have about the responsibilities of women and stimuli and all of that. But right now, I'm going to stop with that because I got to go do some interviews for some amazingly cool people, and I can't wait to show you those later. I want to hear what you think. I want to hear what your family thinks. I want to hear what your significant other, your boyfriend or fiance or husband thinks. Tell me what you think about this. Share it with a friend. Share it on your wall. Post it in your groups. Let's get the conversation going. Talk to you later.